So, hello and welcome everybody to another Sacred Wisdom podcast. In this week's podcast, we are going to discuss European witchcraft. Now, for countless ages, witchcraft has happened in our society, but it's always been left to a myth and part of ancient history. And I am joined with the amazing Stephen Denman today. Hello, how are you doing, bruv?
Hello, Zach. I'm doing very well, and I hope all's good with you.
All is super duper. All is great. So, first of all, although we don't hear of witchcraft publicly, it still goes on today.
Yeah.
And the idea of a wizard is this person with like mysterious powers and has this knowledge and is able to tap into these kind of etheric fields, if you like. I've always wondered where this energy has come from. What are they tapping into? And first and foremost, Steve, what I'm really interested in is, well, I'm sure the viewers are as well, is where does European witchcraft begin? What kind of time period did that start in?
Well, in terms of when we're studying, the concepts of historical narratives say at undergraduate degree level or master's degree level at Oxford University or Cambridge University, and what is written in sort of numerous textbooks on the medieval period or the Middle Ages, we know that the Middle Ages kind of started around 476 AD and lasted to around 1498 AD. And we see during that time the emergence of a definable kind of witchcraft, and European witchcraft. It obviously includes the countries of Western Europe, the countries of Eastern Europe, and obviously, I think more importantly than that, actually, this sceptred isle, the United Kingdom of Great Britain, Albion, Britannia, and also the Emerald Isle of Ireland, and especially in southern Ireland with all the various colonies of Nordic Atlanteans that settled there during the last ice age. And a lot of what we can define as ceremonial magic emerged in parts of southern Ireland as well as in Albion or Britain. And out of that emerged shall we say, the parameters of what can be defined as witchcraft. And obviously, over many centuries, over many generations, the witchcraft started to morph. There were certain ritualistic changes in customs, slight variations. And so really it was the medieval period or the Middle Ages where we really see the definable subject of witchcraft starting to really become very much unique in its own right, as separate from ceremonial magic. And when it comes to defining what a warlock is, we have to say that's a male witch. A wizard is classed as a magician. That is an individual who can be male or female, but predominantly female, who is a holder of secretive knowledge of hidden ideas, of incantations and spells. And so witchcraft in its own right, as I sort of just said, really sort of emerged during the medieval period or the Middle Ages, which kind of lasted from 476 AD to 498 AD.
So do you think the wizards grew out of druidism?
Well, there is an interrelationship between Irish Druidism, British Druidism, and therefore much of European Druidism, and what we can define as witchcraft. Now, witchcraft is really, and for my own researches, and it's probably too much to go into in this Sacred Wisdom podcast, the actual originations of European witchcraft, which includes hedge witchcraft and so forth, really goes back to the time of the divine matriarchy of the civilization known as Atlantis. So really it was a morphing, it was a cultural reworking of the divine matriarchy, of the healing temples, of the various land masses that we can define collectively as Atlantis. And that was obviously the Atlantean continent and the islands of Atlantis. So we'd be going back therefore to a period before 10754 BC to 10753 BC. We're going back really into the time of the Upper Paleolithic. And this is when you see really much of the roots or the originations of what became known as shamanism, of wizardry, ceremonial magic, and witchcraft really starting to emerge. And then over the centuries and many generations and just variations in cultural identities that emerged in different land masses, whether it was in obviously mainland Europe and whatever, or in Albion or Britain, or the Emerald Isle of Ireland, what we see is these are continuations of an original cultural basis that came out of the civilization of Atlantis. And when you actually, for example, read a book like The Occult Sciences in Atlantis by Lewis Spence, you get some very interesting information on how, like the magic arts in Celtic Britain, which was another book that Lewis Spence wrote, which is related to the occult sciences in Atlantis. What you actually see is how there's a lot of interconnectivity between European witchcraft and ceremonial magic, and also aspects of Irish druidism and British druidism, and what you can class as wizardry. And so it's not just a concise subject that's isolated in itself, but we do know that it's very much connected to the divine matriarchy. And I think this is why, whether they were Irish witches, they were British witches, or European witches, they were so vilified, they were so reviled by the Roman Catholic Church, by the Vatican city state, because their origins did go back to the divine matriarchy of Atlantis. And actually, we see the propaganda. For example, when it comes to the festival of Halloween, how
Mm.
witches are portrayed with a greenish, very verdant complexion, with warts, enormous hooked nose, cragged teeth, scraggy hair, and they're flying around on a broomstick, and they look emaciated. They're all bony. They're not exactly very feminine or woman-like. And this is done deliberately to sort of make the idea of witchcraft seem so absolutely repulsive and disgusting and bizarre that it
Mm.
becomes a mockery of the origination of European witchcraft that really was given its definition, as I said, during the medieval period or the Middle Ages, but its origination, its bases, really going back into the Upper Paleolithic and into the Neolithic or the New Stone Age, from the time of Atlantis, where that divine matriarchy was so intensely revered by the male and female citizens of the Atlantean continent and the islands of Atlantis.
I think it's really interesting. I'm not sure what the etymology of witches is, but the etymology of warlock is truth deceiver.
Yeah.
Now that's suggesting that they're not really being honest there. So and we always get this idea that witches are the bad people and wizards are these good guys that serve the higher truth. But then being a truth deceiver, that's not the highest truth, is it? So interesting.
Well, what is more interesting, I think, also is that when you look at the etymology of the word for a druid, so from the Irish Gaelic or the Tianga Gaelic, the Irish language, what we see with the word druid, it comes from Dralthiac or Druthiac, and there's many other variations. And this actually is defined as truth servant. So
Right.
you've got a direct opposite there to the definition from the Old English, I
Interesting.
think, which is the word warlock comes from Veologa in the Old English, which
Right.
means, as you just said, that definition. So you've got the exact opposite
Mm.
to the actual etymology
Of what the
for the
word is.
Irish Druids, the British Druids, and the European Druids. So again, whether that was a word that was placed as a definition by local residents upon male witches as a way of bastardizing them, making them seem horrendous, highly perverted, weird, strange individuals, because their practices went back to the time of Atlantis, and they obviously emulated many of the practices of witches, who are types of female magicians. So for residents, especially those that were converted from, shall we say, Irish paganism or British paganism, European paganism to Christianity, these were seen as very lurid, strange, bizarre practices, and they were promoted as such bizarre practices by the Roman Catholic Church, by the Vatican City State, and to some extent by the Jesuit order. So this was really about the suppression of knowledge, the censorship of knowledge that went back to the time of the civilization on the Atlantean continent and the islands of Atlantis, and also to try and segment or separate any interconnectivity between that civilization and the emergence of Irish Druidism, British Druidism, European Druidism, as well as Irish witchcraft, British witchcraft, and European witchcraft. And, if we take a look at what's, happened with the Roman statesman and the Roman general, Gaius Julius Caesar,
Mm.
who's went with the second invasion of the Roman legions. It wasn't the first, the second invasion of the Roman legions in AD 54. The actual first instruction he gave to the Roman legions was kill all druids on sight,
Mhm.
because they were the holders of knowledge. We see this kind of process then repeated with, with the witches of Ireland, of Britain or Albion, and parts of mainland Europe during the medieval period. We see this literally process of trying to delete the knowledge and the rituals and the ancestral connections of the witches, who are really holding the last remnants of the divine matriarchy
Mm.
before the emergence of this material, shall we say, patriarchy, for want of a better phrase, very, very focused on the acquisition of goods and the use of money, and really a very anti-spiritual, male-dominated Western world that was being planned and rolled out.
Mhm.
So it's a multifaceted level of reasons for the constant mockery and ridicule that was placed against European witchcraft, but
Mm.
also at the same time, it was really, that was a result of the fact that what was being presented there held on to the last remnants and vestiges of the civilization of Atlantis. And you could say this about really many of the Native American tribes, such as the Montaukett, the Algonquin, the Cherokee, and
Mhm.
so forth, that had
Species.
racial and genetic connections to the civilization of Atlantis.
Mm.
And we see the genocide that went on the North American continent, again, to create the deletion of knowledge, the suppression of knowledge. So this has been a very long-term process over many aeons of time. And as we've discussed in other Sacred Wisdom podcasts, the old world empire of Great Tartaria in much more contemporary times was a really a fantastic example of that deletion process.
So the word druid, is that correct in the way drew means tree and wid means to know? Have you
Yeah,
heard of
so
that before? I find that really interesting because it's the knowledge, the tree of knowledge, isn't it? It relates back to that.
tree of knowledge, but again, we have to look at, you're looking into the roots, for example, of the etymology in the Greek language.
Mm.
And we know that the Greeks actually got a lot of their informational knowledge from much older cultures, such as Ireland. There was a lot of actual historical connections between Ireland and classical Greece.
Mm.
But the actual etymology and the actual Gaelic language, the Tianga Gaelic or the Irish language of the word druid, such as Drouthiac or Druthiac, and as I said before, there's many different variations that means truth servant. So
Hmm.
I actually feel I resonate far more with that etymology
Yeah.
than actually the actual etymology from the lingua greca or the Greek language. And I think that's got to be taken into account, that although yes, the what's known as the ye old oak, as it was called in Old English, and it was classed as the royal oak. It was seen as the most sacred of all
Yeah.
trees to the Irish Druids, the British Druids, and the European Druids.
Just to say, it was once seen as treason, wasn't it? If you were to chop down an oak tree, uh,
Yes,
it was counted up to about the 1800s. Actually, I
yeah,
think it was.
that's right. Yeah. So we see this, also there were sacred trees and plants to Irish witches, British witches, and European witches, but not for the same reasons, but they were very much seen as objects of Mother Nature with immense reverence and importance. So, especially when you have a look at, for example, hedge witches that were very much into the use of herbal medicines
Mm.
combined with incantations and spells. So, yeah, it's interesting that also we have to remember that they were seen as a direct threat to the Roman Catholic Church, the
Yeah.
Vatican City State, and the Jesuit order, simply because they specifically were female. They had incredible knowledge. You have to remember that, very much like many of the Irish Druids, British Druids, the European Druids, the witches memorized vast reams of knowledge. It
Mhm.
was there was a mixture of being oral customs that were passed on and different teachings. There obviously was books that were containing spells and incantations and different sort of herbal potions for various specific purposes. But on the whole, most of their knowledge, again, was part of an oral customary tradition that was passed on to, for want of a better phrase, trainee witches.
So,
So
do you think Ireland was like the main landmass that people learnt this knowledge? or was the kind of sacred isle one of the sacred isles there?
We know that Southern Ireland was predominantly glacial sheet free during the last ice age, from around about 10,200 BC down
Right.
to 9,500 BC. So that meant that the actual soil, the gravel, the landmass was fertile. It was also known to be temperate, so they were able to grow fruits and vegetables there. They were able to capture fish, crustacea, mollusks, and various kinds of birds and mammals for food sources. So
Mm.
we know that there was a flourishing there of spiritual and cultural identities. There was communities there, and I think there was a dissemination of knowledge that then
No.
literally bifurcated and separated and went into Albion or Britain and crossed into mainland Europe,
Mm.
where we see this enriched, really long-term suppressed knowledge from Atlantis becoming what we would define as European witchcraft, alongside other customs that evolved and developed in slightly different ways that became what we can define as druidism, and the same with ceremonial magic, and even you can go as far as looking into the use of demonology and necromancy.
Right.
So, and these are obviously, not particularly positive sounding subjects, but we know, for example, in the civilization of Atlantis, apart from the use of genetic hybridization that they became very obsessed with, which we see in
Yeah.
Greek mythology with the centaurs, the minotaurs, the satyrs, the harpies, the cyclopses, and so on and so on, they were very much into the use of raising the dead. So we would call this really Atlantean necromancy.
Yeah.
And so many of these temple priests became necromancers that were really quite obsessed with the
Mm.
idea of raising the dead, creating animated corpses.
Very
And
good.
so these various very regressed, very negatively based spiritual practices, to some extent, were also passed on. Some aspects of druidism inherited those, some aspects of witchcraft inherited those concepts, those ideas, those practices. And again, these really, like, druidism was really a direct threat to the Roman Empire, just as really witchcraft became a direct threat to the Roman Catholic Church,
Mm.
which some people would argue was really in itself culturally an indirect extension of the Roman Empire after it collapsed.
It's amazingly quite ignorant how we kind of just think this has disappeared and just become part of history when it hasn't, and it's all still there. It just operates
Yeah,
in a different field and a different way now.
yeah,
I find it interesting the way the wizard is portrayed nowadays, in the sense you've got Doctor Strange, you've got Emperor Palpatine, Gandalf, Harry Potter, all these kind of
mm,
mythical archetypal figures in films, but they
mm,
don't really represent what these people were. They truly
no,
were. They give this kind of frivolous kind of concept to what they actually were. Again, creating that more inversion, going to the
mm,
opposite to what they actually were.
yeah, and to some extent, but that sensationalism in these movies from Hollywood, that's what goes on. You create the fantastical for the minds of the public to be fascinated, on the cinema screen with such things. And there's always historical distortions, therefore, going to be portrayed in terms of the identities of these whether it's wizards or druids, ceremonial magicians. I think it's interesting to note also that when you take a look at the etymology for the word witch, it
Mm.
does come from the Old English, and that's the word Wicca in the singular, meaning diviner, and that can be spelled Wikkeer or Wicker. So it means diviner. It's
Right.
interesting that in the plural, it's Wiccan, Wikken, or meaning diviners, or Wiccan, Wicken. And
Right.
obviously, that's connected to the word Wicca, which many of you will have heard of,
Yeah.
again from the Old English, it means diviner practices or diviner rituals or something similar.
Mm.
So we or divination perhaps could be what one form of etymology for that word. So that's interesting how the word, Veologa, which was, the Old English word for a warlock,
Mm.
its meaning is radically different from the etymology for that of the female counterpart being the witch. Interesting.
Yes.
So and it's interesting, if you look at the word warlock, you have the word warlord,
Mm.
warfare.
Mm.
So it's interesting that that three-letter word represents the idea of
Mm.
conflict or confrontation and so forth. So there's a little bit of a maybe a cultural contradiction there. I do feel that that was probably an etymology placed on male witches, sometime going right back into the early medieval period,
Mm.
really to sort of to really
Well, in the
expose
medieval
actually
period,
bizarre and unusual.
it was called wizard, wasn't it? Without the Z, and it was actually
Yeah.
the S, and that was it actually only meant originally meant wise man.
That's right. It's
So,
connected to the idea of a seer, a
mm,
wise man. And perhaps you could even class that as an enlightened being, because what a seer is an enlightened being, somebody that has access to higher knowledge,
yeah.
and they have become completely at peace with the infinite oneness and the infinite nowness of the universal creator of heaven and earth.
Mm. So, how would you say this is operating today? And because this hasn't disappeared, this witchcraft, and this is operating in another way. And what do you think's going on there? What where is this kind of magic being performed? Do you think it's at the certain rituals, certain ceremonies that are put together, or are we living in a form of witchcraft at the moment in society?
I don't think. I mean, there's always been those rumors in the woo woo conspiracies that witchcraft is connected to Satanism. It's connected to, because obviously there are Pacific festivals connected to, that are really integral to much of European witchcraft. And yeah, and you hear all these stories, these accounts of witches being connected to Satanism and devil worship. But again, we have to also remember a lot of that was disseminated by the Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican city states, and the Jesuit order, and really goes back again to the early medieval period, and really continued as a form of propaganda
Mm,
to make individuals, local residents, actually feel repulsed and angered and disgusted by the presence of witches, and to drive them out from their communities.
mm,
So I don't really think there is that much of a connection. I think ceremonial magic is far more commonly used, such as, the teachings of Edward Alexander Crowley, or as he
yeah,
was best known, Aleister Crowley, the infamous English occultist and really erudite Satanist, who was utterly driven by the
best
idea of
darkness.
controlling demons or negative entities from the 4D holographic reality, the astral plane, more specifically the infernal regions of the lower astral.
Mm,
And he felt that he was some sort of almost, divine being that had this right to summon such entities and control these various supernatural impulses beyond space time. And it was really a huge male ego
mm.
that Edward Alexander Crowley or Aleister Crowley had. And there are many other ceremonial magicians, whether they're English or Scottish or Welsh or from some country in Europe, or the United States of America or Canada, who've had this sort of belief.
How was the Anglo-Saxon culture connected to witchcraft, and what did they do with that witchcraft? I mean, was it all just dark purposes, or did they actually have it for healing purposes and to empower people? What was it all?
Well, we have to first remember the Anglo-Saxon culture in many ways paralleled the emergence of the early medieval period. And so historians kind of give these kind of parameters that the Anglo-Saxon culture emerged around 408 BC and continued till 1105 AD. And so obviously that contained much really of the medieval period or the Middle Ages were in there. I mean, obviously not exactly, but there was a long-term parallel there. So what we see is, again, because obviously Christianity from the Roman Catholic Church had taken hold. This is obviously before the time of the dissolution of the monasteries and so forth. So there was very tight control by the English Catholic Church on behalf of the Roman Catholic Church on the Italian peninsula, and therefore the Vatican city state and the Jesuit order. And again, Christianity was very, very widespread, in England. And so witchcraft became increasingly frowned upon and was something that was really then suppressed and driven out in this country. So,
Do you
and you
think
see the
it
same
more
thing
pushed
occurred in
into
Europe.
was it pushed into the churches and the religious settlements? Is that the idea, and went into the popes and the bishops, and they contain that knowledge? I mean,
To some extent, yeah, we know the Vatican archives. There are vast tomes and volumes of information there that have been covertly retrieved from the time of Irish Druidism, British Druidism, European Druidism, from the time, therefore, of the Roman legions and their invasions into different territories. We know, for example, that when vast caches of knowledge suddenly vanish, they're not suddenly destroyed in a conflagration,
No.
and burned to ash. They are covertly removed, taken, and they're taken into subterranean reaches, one of which is the Vatican archives, again below Rome in central Italy. There are many other locations, but that's one of the most important. So it's about the removal of knowledge that was commonplace, such as European witchcraft, that was fully understood. And originally, witchcraft was not something that was frowned upon. It was readily and openly accepted by local residents and communities. And in its original formation, witches of all kinds were revered and respected as
They were healers.
patriarchal elders. So it's interesting how, again, it's about communal fragmentation, suppression of knowledge, and the intervention by the Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican City State, the Jesuit order, as with the various European crowns or royal houses, to keep control for themselves. They then get access to that private knowledge, but it's not beneficial in any way to share that with the common folk, the peasantry, the laity, the congregations in the chapels, churches, and cathedrals. They get given specific bits of information that's obviously read in classical Greek, and it's read in Vulgate Latin during the medieval periods, and obviously translated into Old English or whatever language. It can also be obviously the Irish, Gaelic, or Cymric, Welsh, etc. And this is what you find going is the bifurcation and suppression of knowledge, and what is then disseminated is only done so in very small fragments for very short periods in a very restricted way to Homo sapiens or human beings, but they therefore don't get the chance to become spiritually liberated. But things are now rapidly starting to change here on planet Earth. So there's only a few more years before we see the emergence of this new golden age or golden period in 2034, 2035, and then it's onward from there.
So it was after the bubonic plague, wasn't it, 1347, that the
Yeah,
witches were just completely hunted down, right? And that was
yeah,
where the complete persecution of witches and wizards and
yeah.
all this information. And they were blamed for that plague as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, the bubonic plague, again, is another vast conspiracy. How it started, I don't believe the official historical narrative is correct. And what we see is that after the devastation of the bubonic plague, which apparently occurred in mainland Europe from the 15th of August 1347 to the 28th of October 1353, European Christians were being given huge amounts of very deviant, very kind of like inverted propaganda, where the Vatican City State and the Jesuit priests, and they knew exactly what they were doing, focused all attention upon European witches as the cause. It was
Mm,
their evil magic had caused the bubonic plague. So it was problem, reaction, solution.
mm.
I believe the bubonic plague was artificially induced, possibly by various rulers or the royal houses of Europe, possibly by the Jesuit order. Again, that's open to speculation. It's not clear really in terms of
Not enough
evidential
history.
documentation.
Yeah.
What we know is I don't believe the officially presented narrative,
Yeah.
and then that was
Often the
used as the
case.
perfect excuse. Well, this has been, you can see this formula has been used in, shall we say, the modern age. We don't need to go into details in terms of modern
Yeah.
age
100%.
basic geopolitics. And that's all we need to say. It's a classic ruse that's used to
Mm,
then have the excuse that's needed in problem reaction solution to deal with a problem that's seen as a threat to the elite secret societies, policymakers, whatever. And
mm.
so it therefore then drove out and fragmented the last vestiges of the divine matriarchy that had really kind of held on to that knowledge going back thousands of years or aeons of time to the civilization of Atlantis. And that divine matriarchy was immensely potent and was revered and was really comprised of very elegant females that were very psychic, were very telepathic, and were experts in energy medicine, and were experts in the use of cymatic patterns, the use of rhythmic sound for healing purposes. So what happened with witchcraft, that then becomes morphed and deviated through centuries, and the original basis of that knowledge that was held by the divine matriarchy of Atlantis then itself became fragmented over many generations. You'd say the same with druidism, ceremonial
Mm.
magic, or wizardry. So it's the same repeating process that was taking place. So it really was the beginning of the end of European witchcraft when it came to the bubonic plague, and it set into motion many centuries of persecution against Irish witches, British witches, and the witches of various countries, especially I think in France, what we know today is Belgium and the Netherlands, and places like Denmark, and obviously Germany and Austria and other countries in mainland Europe.
And it allowed people to fight amongst themselves. So it's
Yeah,
almost like it created the problem, put it out in society,
fear and
and
division
yeah,
is
divided,
massive.
then created conflict again. If people need to see that pattern because that's going on in today's age
So
as well.
both sides. So the Christian parishioners as the peasantry, the yeomen of medieval, Europe were
Mm,
pitted against the basically the witches, who were already a very small minority. So then they became the outcast that went off to live in the natural world, amongst the trees and the plants and the birds and the mammals of Mother Nature,
mm.
because that's the only areas they had any level of sanctuary or safety from the constant persecution.
How did Christianity affect all this in the sense of this witchcraft? And was what do you think? As I said before, do you think it was actually used in religious terms? Like they actually started using it in religion or priests and certain people of high authority.
No, witchcraft, there wasn't any absorption of the cultural practices of European witchcraft into the Roman Catholic Church. What they did do, and as we've discussed in other Sacred Wisdom podcasts, was they absorbed the practices of what we know today as Irish Druidism, British Druidism, and European Druidism. And it was Irish Druidism out of all the different forms of those male and female practices that was seen and deemed as immensely important. And so we see this going back even to the time of the Roman Empire with the imperial colleges of Rome. We see the various academies of Rome absorbing much of the knowledge that was taught by the Irish Druids and the British Druids, and therefore that's the actual priests that existed on the Emerald Isle and the priests that existed on the Sceptred Isle of Albion. But because this is all well known, this was known to the Roman statesmen, to Roman generals, to Roman emperors. It was very well known, including obviously an individual like Gaius Julius Caesar, who was utterly ruthless. They really didn't care. They knew that the knowledge of the Druids had to be absorbed because it was actually seen as so potent, but it had to be removed and suppressed. And this process then was repeated, obviously, in the Vatican archives of the Roman Catholic Church with the Jesuits. And we know that it's purported there are connections between much of the demise of the Old World Empire of Great Tartaria in northern Russia, and obviously in its various colonies that existed across the Caucasus region, mainland Europe, and North America, and elsewhere.
Mm,
We see this destruction. We see, for example, the destructions of the cities like Shalaga in the
mm,
United States of America and Norumbega in the United States of America,
mm,
where if you actually read the accounts of the Tartarian architecture that was used in those cities, they were so opulent, so luxurious, so elegant, but it wasn't because it was about putting an economic value on such opulence. It was based on the spiritual beauty and integrity of the Nordic Tartarians and the Turkic peoples that had founded and developed Great Tartaria, and actually embodied that and represented that in their Tartarian architecture, and obviously connecting that to the ether or the telluric electricity that was drawn down into the various features that we can collectively define as Tartarian architecture, for the use obviously of transportation, the use of healing, for the use of lighting, for heating, and so on and so on. So the
I
world
just
is
interject.
radically different.
I found it really interesting. You just saying about the architecture. This leads on perfectly, but from a little bit of research I looked into for the podcast, there was the ancient Greeks had Orpheus, and he wasn't like a musician. And apparently, playing could charm even rocks into dancing. I find that
Yeah,
interesting. So he was using music in this form of levitation, acoustic levitation, which you spoke about.
yeah,
And yeah, he was seen as a kind of a magician, a wizard in
yeah.
this way. So it
That's right.
ties into Shalaga because I think that was definitely built in a way that is so beyond comprehension of how we see today.
That's right. And when you look at that information and going back to how the Roman Catholic Church then took over, for example, in here in the United Kingdom of Great Britain, there were three archdruid councils. Now, the
Mm,
three archdruid councils were based in Canterbury, in Kent, in southeast England, Westminster Abbey, where the city of Westminster in central London, today, where you see the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and then on top of that, you go up to York here in the United Kingdom, and that was the third location. So they built these
York
opulent,
Cathedral. Yeah. York
yeah, that's
Cathedral
right. So
is
you've got
amazing. That's yeah.
exactly. So you look at the architectural features there, and so we see these. Obviously, these were all connected to obviously Christianity, but it's the same process. It's just an earlier version of
Mm,
what was done with the Old World Empire of Great Tartaria, which was the summation of other people's knowledge that was then absorbed and integrated and removed from access to the everyday Homo sapiens or human beings, to
mm,
stop them becoming liberated, to try and prevent them becoming self-aware.
mm,
And that's in itself very interesting. But if you take, for example, Vedic India, such in-depth, profound knowledge in terms of Eastern mysticism, perhaps you can class as Eastern occultism,
mm,
amongst the various enlightened individuals of Vedic India, was actually readily available to many of the ordinary individual people there who were Hindus.
mm,
So a very different approach was taken, but yeah, and they built the chapels, churches, and cathedrals on specific geomagnetic ley lines and intersections where
mm.
there had been the druid groves, the druid shrines, where there had been the archdruid councils, and this
Yeah.
included obviously the Emerald Isle of Ireland and the Sceptred Isle of Albion or Britain, as with many different locations across France and Belgium, the Netherlands, and Denmark and Germany and Austria and elsewhere.
Yeah. No, I mean it goes throughout. We're talking about the deletion
Yeah.
everywhere, every single culture. It's
Oh, that
had this
happened
a
there. Happened
deletion, this
everywhere.
elimination. I mean, obviously you had the Russian gulags as well in Siberia, where
Yeah.
that was lots of people were sent there
Well, the
with
labour
esoteric
camps of
knowledge and stuff.
Siberia and other parts of the Russian Far East. Yeah, that was part of a reprogramming process, indoctrination through
Mm,
trauma and working extremely long hours and in absolutely frigid sub-zero conditions. It was very bleak, and it was designed to dumb down the Russian people.
just thinking about it, probably the last standing culture, where we can, there's lots of mini tribes and cultures that are getting decimated, but you have the Aboriginals, obviously,
Yeah.
and that's one of the last connections I feel
Yeah, well,
in a.
the Aborigines in the landmass of Australia, as you know, in the Sanskrit language of India, the
Mm,
actual landmass of Australia was called Mahalanka, meaning
that's
Great
right.
Island, was actually a very large segment of the Lemurian continent in the
Yeah.
Asia Pacific region, and the Tamil Dravidia of southern India, as with many of the Sri Lankans and also the Aborigines, are all genetically related.
Yeah.
And this is very important to note that in their genetics, their ancestral origins, they are completely connected
Mm,
to the civilization of Lemuria. But of course, there's been massive deletion, massive suppression, and we see the way the Aborigines are being treated across
mm,
different areas in Australia, and how their very, Aboriginal shamanism um, really has been suppressed, has been broken, has been fragmented, and
mm,
is not particularly seen as acceptable in many parts of that landmass. So it
mm,
is an ongoing, repeating process of deletion, control, suppression, the use of propaganda, the rewriting and the reworking of historical narratives. And this is obviously just almost like in many ways like an inverted sort of demonic software program that just is run and just loops over and over again for thousands of years.
And I think it's looping in a way for humans to see it happening and see
Yeah.
it looping. And it's only when we become aware to it. And this is where we're at the moment, is actually people accepting that
Yeah.
there may be a very dark force on this planet that doesn't have the humans' best interests. And that's really what people have a problem with in this
Yeah.
day and age, is accepting. They often have been primed to believe that everything is, they're being looked after, everything is for the best and for the highest intention. But we can clearly see that there are some things happening at the moment that are not serving the higher good. uh is there, so would you say all this knowledge that disappeared, that it was concealed into the Vatican library, or do you feel that it was, just taken into underground settlements or underground places, or is it all held in the Vatican library? And
No,
if
it's not all held. It's not all. As I said earlier, there's other caches of knowledge held elsewhere. It's not. I mean, we could discuss the Paris Catacombs as an example.
yeah.
We know there's many access passageways there that have been closed off from public access. I
Mm.
think literally less than 1/10 of the Paris Catacombs have public access.
Oh
Now,
yeah.
why is there over 7 million skeletons down there that comprise the Paris
Yeah,
Catacombs? How did they all end up in that subterranean expanse under Paris in north central France?
you
We
don't see
know
the mainstream ever discuss that subject and how
that.
vast that is, that there is 7 million, nearly 7 million. I didn't know it was that high.
Yeah, it's
Dead
around
bodies
seven
down there,
million
unbelievable.
skeletons. Yeah, how they did that, they must have done literally segmented over weeks, counting in stages.
Mm.
With many people, they're literally counting and maybe demarcating the different skeletal remains, the skulls, the various bones. I don't know, but we know that that's a vast number of people. How long it took for that number of skeletons to accumulate in the Paris catacombs
Mm.
is no one's really going to know that. We do know that they were actively using ceremonial magic there, because remnants of various artifacts that are used in ceremonial magic and were found in numerous locations in the Paris catacombs. So what was going on down there, again, nobody knows, but we know there's connections to various buildings in Paris and to the sacred geometry of
Yes,
Paris
very
when it
much.
comes to its location. So there's so
Mm.
many unanswered questions to do with, what the historical narrative that we've been given as seemingly factual, inverted commas, when
Mm.
in actuality what we find is there is such overwhelming numbers of questions that are unanswered, and Western science, as usual, whether it's the Smithsonian Institution in Washington DC, Oxford University, Cambridge University, and so on, they're not interested. And again, we're not going to see any of this information reported in New Scientist or Scientific American or Nature magazine. We may perhaps see it in the excellent magazine known as Nexus,
Yeah.
that is managed, by the owner and editor Duncan Rhodes. We know that could well have information at some point. Who knows? Maybe not.
Mm.
But that's open to speculation in itself. But what we do know is that there's Europe, like parts of Latin America, has vast archaeological based anomalies that don't make any sense. And when you start giving these historical presentations that are so readily repeated
Mm.
by by, shall we say, Western science, it doesn't add up. When you start to do the investigations and the researches yourself, you start finding all these contradictions, and they're so glaring that you kind of think, well, how come they're not talking about this? And then you start to realize, well, we're the only individuals that are going to really carry on doing this, and that's really what the Sacred Wisdom podcast is about, is on every level generically is doing these investigations,
Mm.
making that effort, and being very critical and independent minded in our approach to information. And we never say, unless we've actually got it documented, we'll say, there's speculation that this happened, or
Mm.
it's postulated that happened, and so on. So
And it's
but
let people make their own mind up, and actually
yeah,
research for themselves. All the research we give you, as Stephen said, it's based on what we found. So it's for
yeah,
you to have a look into and actually research it and make your own mind up. Nobody can convince you of this. You've really kind of got to resonate with it yourself and get to know it. It's like all truth, really. You have to persevere and actually understand the information. It's not as simple as someone just telling it to you. How was witchcraft a threat to these institutions? What was going on there, or the Roman Empire? What were they afraid of, do you think?
I mean, going back to the Roman Empire, it was much more to do with kinds of ceremonial magic, I'd say, and obviously Irish Druidism, British Druidism, and European Druidism. But what we have to understand is from the most initial onsets, the Roman Catholic Church focused its attention on the destruction of the divine matriarchy when it came to European witchcraft. When we look at medieval Europe and then onwards into the time of the early modern period, or in Europe,
Mm,
what we see is that witchcraft was apparently thwarted by the use of protected ceremonial magic. Now, in the Irish Gaelic, or the Tianga Gaelic, or the Irish language, what is interesting that the phrase Draoch Bian, which means white magic, is actually connected to the word for druid. So Drouthiac or Druthiac, and here we have a connection between the word magic and truth servant.
right.
And it's interesting when you look then at the etymology in the Greek language, and when it comes to white magic, which is lefki, so again, it's lefki magia, meaning white holding power.
Right.
So the actual etymology of the word magic, or magia, as it was known in the Greek language at the time and still is today, it means holding power. So ceremonial magic represented holding immense potency.
Mm,
And I think it was seen as a counteraction against European witchcraft because the divine matriarch in its own right was immensely powerful
mm,
and was seen as something that was a direct threat on many levels to, I don't know, masculinity, in for want of a better word. I
right.
think there was, quite a lot of conflict between the genders when it came to these kinds of control, and there wasn't anything in terms of a compatibility issue there. But when it came to druidism, there was complete equality between the sexes. There was just as many druidesses as druids,
Mm,
and they were trained just as well, and they were just as good and proficient as being druids as their male counterparts. So this is a very intricate subject to discuss. It's not like you can say there's one clear cut way of thinking with this in terms of saying, yeah, it can all be categorized like this or categorized like that.
mm,
And even in the lingua latina, or the Latin language, white magic was known as magicus albus.
right.
So it
Okay.
was known in terms of Roman mythology, Roman folklore, as being something that could repel uh,
Mm,
dark spells or malevolent incantations that had come from, I don't know, shall we say, the most rudimentary of witches that would have existed during the Roman Empire. Not exactly in the same way they become concisely defined, as I said, during the medieval period or the Middle Ages in
mm,
mainland Europe and so forth. So, but it's interesting that on a more generic level, when it comes to the word magia, meaning holding power from the Greek language,
mm.
that in itself would be seen as a direct threat ultimately by the Roman Catholic Church,
Yeah, because
because
they wanted
only
the
they
power.
had the ability, they had in their minds that the Pope and the bishops and everyone else, they had the divine right, they had the sovereign right and the divine right of rulership over Homo sapiens, or human beings,
Mm,
because of the teachings of the Holy Bible.
mm.
And their instructions were final, and what they said had to be adhered to, and nothing else could actually threaten that. So that's all I've got to say on the matter, really.
Well, that's absolutely incredible, Steve. And you're totally right. Everything we've had a slow deletion over many years. This isn't something that's just happened in the last 100, 200 years. It's been gone over, I would say, the last 2000 years. It seems to be this huge deletion process over many, many lifetimes. And it's our job to look into this and research it. And like Stephen said earlier, we are giving this information to you so you can delve deeper into it and actually research it yourself and find this information and find ways to empower yourself through it. And this is really important in these times because we are going through some very peculiar, I would say, strange situations that don't sometimes make much sense to people. And when you look at these subjects, it can help you give you a better understanding to what is going on around you at this present time. It's also a chapter available in our book, on this as well in Luminous Worlds, and the book is available on Amazon in paperback and ebook, or you can purchase that on my website. Thank you, Stephen. That's been brilliant. Excellent job, and it's a bye from me.
And it's goodbye for me.